Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Halftime Talk feature interview series. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Gary King, President of ICE Futures Abu Dhabi. Gary, thanks so much for joining us today.
No, pleasure, Diallo. Always good to be here and nice to see you again.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Well, look, it's a really exciting time, obviously, for oil and commodity markets in general, isn't it? I mean, there's so much going on, but we're going to try and focus this interview a bit more micro on the futures exchange in Abu Dhabi, on Murban crude, and a few other questions around the indices and benchmarks developments that are happening in the region, and get your sort of updates and views on that. Let's start with talking about Murban crude in terms of the expectations for volumes this year, and give us a brief synopsis on how you ended 2023 and what your expectations are for that contract to gain even more traction, if you like, in 24, and why, if so.
Yeah, thank you, Diallo. So I think giving some background and some context, like you mentioned, the markets from a top level review. Broadly across our entire ICE global oil complex, we saw record average daily volumes in 2023, and particularly our Brent contract, which finished the year as the largest and most liquid oil contract in the world. We're delighted by the metrics that we're seeing, the growth in the Murban contract, where we had a record month in February across all metrics in terms of volume, open interest, and physical deliveries. We saw an average daily volume of just around 18,000 contracts a day in February, and we continue to see that trend continuing through March. And our volumes with Murban are up around 117% over year on year. We've seen since the launch, 5.5 million contracts have traded since the launch, which is equivalent. I mean, these are big numbers, 5.5 billion barrels of oil. I mean, these are very large numbers, and we've seen over 150 participants globally trade the exchange, and that includes Asia, Middle East, Europe, and the US. So it's all extremely encouraging, and we're delighted with the performance to date. And obviously we expect to see this go from strength to strength, and the latest news from Bloomberg is testament to that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a bit about that in terms of Bloomberg including that now into their sort of, or creating a new Murban crude oil index alongside their commodity index. And I mean, what do you think spurred that? I mean, obviously you can tell me numbers, that it's gaining traction, but and what impact do you think that will have, if you like, if any?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's testament to the growth in the contract. So it's been adopted. It demonstrates that it's growing prominence in crude oil trading as a future contract alongside Brent and WTI. So it supports that growth story that we've just discussed. And the benchmark, the Bloomberg Commodity Index, is a prestigious index, and we see this attracting more and more investor interest in the contract, because alongside Brent and WTI, it gives investors exposure to a Middle East crude oil with its differences in quality, its geographic positioning, and the transportation logistics. So this is all very encouraging, and it fits with His Excellency Dr. Sultan Al Jaber and the UAE leadership in making the UAE positioning itself in the global energy space. So we're super encouraged by it, and we're receiving just calls about this on a regular basis. And what does this mean, and the trajectory? But it's an extremely exciting development, and it's significant.
I mean, it does certainly feel like, I think 2 years or 3 years on from the contract start, that now there's a real sort of irreversible momentum. It's got there. We're getting that traction. after 2 or 3 years of ups, volumes sort of not being, let's say, consistent. The other plan that Abu Dhabi has is the Upper Zakum crude that I think is planning to be listed at some point on ICE Abu Dhabi. It was sort of projected to perhaps happen last year. Is that still in the cards? Again, explain to us the reasoning behind that and why.
Okay. I'll give you the response to that. I don't have anything to add on that particular subject, Diala. We'll advise when we have an update to provide. But what I would like to say, important to say, is that there is significant interest in this contract that is out there. There's this latent, huge bubbling interest, and that's all I'm in a position to say at this time.
Okay, great. No, that's good. We'll wait to hear that news. Let's get your views also. I don't know if we've had you, well, we've had you obviously on other platforms at Gulf Intelligence, but not this particular interview. But last year, of course, we had another, let's switch to WTI and Brent and look at the sort of WTI being moved into the dated Brent benchmark. Of course, that's had impact already on spreads between those two, etc. But do you think that was a good move, and why? And what kind of does it tell us, if anything, about future trends for these very established benchmarks?
That's a great question. So we, as ICE, we have the Midland WTI contract that's delivered out of Houston, not out of Cushing, which is a very important distinction. And we're seeing this delivered into the Brent basket. So what we're seeing now is these arbitrage opportunities for this crude oil to flow into Asia and also into Europe. And we're also seeing people trade Murban against that WTI Houston Midland contract as well. So we see this all becoming part of a big ecosystem, a larger ecosystem, where customers can hedge, manage their risk exposures with these different crude grades. And of course, the Midland WTI, being a sweet crude, can move into Asia and Europe depending upon the arbitrage. So it's another a great story. It's another important development in the energy markets, and we're proud to be involved in both parts of that ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another exchange that's in the region is the Dubai Mercantile Exchange, of which you used to be obviously at. And I'm not to sort of get you to comment on other exchanges, but again, on market developments. We saw Saudi Tadawul Group take a stake in DME. And again, it's kind of showing more sort of infused energy into exchanges in the region. We did talk to the DME about that a few weeks ago, and they said, it's a big development for them, etc. What does it mean? And one comment that came out is it's, they're going to possibly extend into, other commodities, in terms of including them on the index. I mean, just that general question of incorporating basically increased number of commodities onto these regional exchanges, these young exchanges at the end of the day, some of them. Do you think there's room for that? Do you think that why is it happening now and not, 5 years ago?
I'll take a holistic view and say the region, this part of the world is, you're seeing this center of gravity. There's been this history of energy between the Middle East and Asia. It's been a story that's been there for quite some time. So it tells you something that's going on in this part of the world, okay? But I typically, as you can appreciate, don't comment on that, especially with my former colleagues down the road. Comment on other companies' business initiatives or transactions just out of normal practice. But I think if you step back and look at the region from outside, then there's a story here. I think everyone's seeing, with all the companies moving into this part of the world.
And I mean, do you think there's room for I mean, what would you say would be, another index that would be obvious, low-lying fruit out there that needs to be created and grabbed?
I think you're seeing it already with what we're discussed with Bloomberg's Murban Index. There's other products that we can talk about down the line that could be developed off this, like ETFs and all these things. Once you have an index, but being part of this index where we're sitting alongside Brent and WTI, there's a story here, right? And we're really excited about being part of that story. And and delivering on the vision here of pivoting and positioning the UAE in the global energy story.
Yeah,
And that's why we're pretty excited about this.
And of course, part of that energy story, Gary, is trading, which is what indices are used for, ultimately. And of course, ADNOC has a very active trading desk, Aramco as well established. We're seeing more and more of those by the different NOCs in the region gaining traction, not only selling their own crude, but looking to start selling third-party crude. Again, this whole trading unit world of the NOCs here, again, growing, investment being put into those. Let me ask you just again a general sort of macro question on that. Is that an obvious move, do you think, for the NOCs to do? Do you think that'll become more of a segment of their business? And if so, why? Not specifically ADNOC, just generally in the region.
I think it's a great development. And I remember being involved in this when I was with Enoch many years ago, and we set up a trading team and an office in Singapore. And that was some time ago. And now we've obviously seen ADNOC, but we see this initiative developing with NOCs across the region. I think it's a great thing. It signifies that companies are looking at risk management and the use of derivatives in those risk management initiatives. But also what it will do is bring more liquidity into the market. And liquidity is everything. It's the volume of trade, and that the greater the liquidity, the greater the price discovery and transparency for price. So I think this is all extremely healthy, and I can see this continuing to develop across the region.
Yeah, and I mean, what is your sense? Let's talk now a bit more broadly. Maybe get your views on just commodities in general, the direction, trend. Nothing to do with the exchanges necessarily, but just pricing going forward. We've obviously had some volatility on crude prices in the last 2-3 years, post COVID, etc. A lot of change there. We're currently at a healthy Brent price, which has been sort of accepted by consumers and producers, and has been pretty steady so far. But in terms of your trajectory for what you see as the sort of influencers on prices this year, let's get your view on where you think oil markets are going in general, and in terms of taking into account things like global economic growth, etc. What's your sentiment and the feedback you're getting from those you work with?
So, running an exchange, I typically don't comment on views on price direction or pricing or any of that. That's not my job here. Our job is to provide a highly regulated platform where people can manage their risk exposure. What we have seen is obviously periods of geopolitical instability and periods of high volatility. And again, what at ICE with our products, what we've demonstrated is to meet those requirements for people to manage these exposures and price risk in very difficult, challenging times. So that's our role, is to continue to do this. And again, I think that's why the Murban inclusion into the Bloomberg Index is significant, because investors can look at their portfolios and refine them and say, you have Brent, you have WTI, but you now have a Middle East crude oil stream called Murban, and then that has its own intricacies around risk and exposure to certain geographies, transportation, all those things. So I don't know if I answered your question, Diala, but that's where I see it.
Yeah. I mean, these are just sort of, forward-looking, not exact projections, but trends that we might see are needed by the market.
Yeah.
What about on the product side, Gary? Just a sort of forward-looking viewpoint. We're seeing Middle East refineries expand production in terms of volume. We've seen refineries in Asia also expanding, while Europe and the US refining, I suppose, activity steadily declines. Do you see a potential for a products-led more indices or developments on that front that would warrant that going forward? I mean, I'm talking about 5-10 year projection, not next year.
I think that's possible. I mean, we've seen new refineries added on out of Kuwait and Oman. So I think when we've seen stories in the press, people opening up offices in Fujairah. So I think all those things are they're valid observations. And I think also following on from COP28, I think the UAE is as a leader in this transition space. So I think there's a huge opportunity in environmental and climate products and initiatives. So that's something else I think is somewhere where the UAE is a leader in the space.
Yeah, I mean things like sort of, I suppose, aviation fuels and cleaner bunker fuels, etc. And do you see Fujairah as, I mean, it's already obviously a hub for bunkering, but it has been working very hard to establish itself, as a growing hub, if you like, for an increased number of products, whether it's crude and other refined products as well. What are the indicators there for Fujairah versus other ports that are developing in the region, such as Zakum, etc.? Is there room for all of them? Is there a particular niche that you see one would have over the other, which would make sense from a comprehensive point of view?
I mean, Fujairah has done a phenomenal job in creating the infrastructure that it has, and commands a leading space in the industry in product storage and particularly around fuel oil. So I think it will continue to address some of these market developments. So I think there's a lot to do there. And like I heard the other day that people are looking at gasoline and other things. Again, I'm not in that space, but yeah, and I think, as we all know, and I have the T-shirt, creating benchmarks is not, it's a hard job. So it takes time, and the energy industry is typically quite conservative, and quite rightly so, because you're talking about GDPs and other important issues. So it takes time, but I think Fujairah in itself is definitely well situated, and the leadership there are doing a phenomenal job.
Yeah, absolutely. Gary, just one final question. We started by talking about volumes on the contract, the Murban contract.
Yeah.
And you'd said 117% year on year.
Yeah.
The start of this year. Okay, let's look at your projection. You can't, obviously, you don't have the crystal ball in front of you, but given the trend, by the end of the year, how much stronger do you think we'll see a year than we did last year, which admittedly was very good as well?
Yeah, as you say, I mean, people put numbers out there, and that could be bad for your health. But I see the exchange going from strength to strength. We have new customers coming onto the exchange every day. We see indices like the Bloomberg Murban thing. So I see the trend is very positive. I expect to see volumes grow, open interest grow, but particularly what you'd like to see is the depth of the curve, as we call it. So you see trades go further and further out, and that I think we'll continue to see that going forward, Diala.
Gary
and particularly,
King,
particularly when you have things like the Midland WTI contract, and that moves and it goes into the Brent complex, I think you'll see people trade and arbitrage all these different contracts. So I think it's going to be a positive development.
Yeah, that's interesting how that's become very positive, obviously, for this side of the world as well, and the exchanges here. Gary King, president of ICE Futures Abu Dhabi, thanks so much for joining us today on Halftime Talk. It's been great to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Diala. Lovely to see you again. Thanks for having me.